Now with our political roundtable, let's talk about the Obama agenda. And you may not have known this or heard about it, but we had a fair amount of snow here in Washington over the past couple of weeks. Here is a cartoon that really captures the nexus between government and weather. Huge snowstorm. One guy says Washington is completely paralyzed. The other one says, and then came this snowstorm. And here we are, David Brooks, with a domestic agenda right now. And what's leading this off? It's not health care at the moment. It is a jobs bill. And there seemed to be bipartisan consensus on this. And now Majority Leader Harry Reid pulled it back, made it a much narrower bill, about $15 billion, mostly of tax breaks, to get people back to work. Is this going to go anywhere?
It'll go somewhere. But if this was your week to hate Washington, this was a good week for you. Because we got this bipartisan bill that emerged in the Senate, filled with pork and all sorts of things that people hate. Fine. But at least the White House signs off on it. But Harry Reid decides, after the White House has signed off on it, that it's the liberals in his party have objected. So we got the pork, and he decides, I'm getting rid of the whole thing, or at least scaling it back to something about $15 billion a year. So then we get partisanship. And then on top of that, it's basically pointless. $15 billion a year in a multi-trillion-dollar economy is nothing. Will create no jobs. So we had partisanship, pork, and pointlessness all in one bill. And so this was a bad week for Washington.
Congressman Schock, where are the Republicans going to be on this?
Well, look, I think, unfortunately, it's more of the same. I mean, all of this talk about bipartisanship, and yet the rhetoric doesn't match the reality. As David Brooks mentioned, there was some Republicans who worked with the Democrats in the Senate to come up with a jobs bill, only to have their leadership put the kibosh on it. We are for creating long-term economic growth. You do that by incentivizing entrepreneurialism, risk-taking, and investment. You do that through creating certainty in the markets, through certain tax incentives. And that's where we'll be on a jobs bill.
So it sounds like you like what the Democrats are doing here.
Well, I don't like all the pork that was in the bill. The $787 billion stimulus bill, the largest spending bill in history. One of the reasons why it didn't create long-term growth is it didn't have stimulative tax cuts in it, but rather a lot of pork and spending.
Which are the least stimulative things in the stimulus. I mean, when you assess what creates jobs in the stimulus ban, it's the tax cuts that were put in order to try to win Republican votes that didn't come anyway, that are the least effective thing in the stimulus bill. So the theory doesn't match the practice here. But, you in your district,
I
just this week you were at a community college touting a $350,000 green technology education program, talking about how great that was going to be for your district. You voted against the bill that created that grant. And so that's happening a lot, with Republicans sort of taking credit for things that Democratic bills do, and then Republicans simultaneously touting their votes against them and trashing them. That's, I think, a problem that needs to be resolved within your caucus, because, I mean, you seem like a very nice person, but that's a very hypocritical stance to take.
Well, Rachel, with all due respect, I can assure you Republicans were not consulted on a stimulus bill. That bill was filed at 11 p.m. The night before the 10:30 a.m. we began debating it. None of our amendments were considered. There was no debate, no bipartisanship on that bill.
But let me pick up, Rachel, which is the question about you. You've called for spending caps out of Washington. But to Rachel's point, does that mean that you will not accept any federal money that comes the way of your district?
No, I think that argument that liberals are making is absolutely ridiculous. With all due respect, Rachel, does that mean you're going to give back your Bush tax cuts that you continue to rail against? The fact of the matter is our country operates and governed by a majority. And I, along with almost all of my Republican colleagues and a good number of Democrats, have voted against the stimulus, the omnibus, all of this runaway spending. But we've lost those battles in the House. And at the end of the day,
but you'll take the money for your district.
At the end of the day, my constituents and their children and grandchildren will be on the hook for the debt that's being created by this majority, and they deserve to have their fair share of federal spending.
Harold, I was in Congress for 10 years. I can tell you, your party ran up a lot of debt. Matter of fact, we grew from the 8 years that President Bush was there. The rate of growth exceeded any other presidents in the history of the nation. So we find ourselves in a moment. Well, no, this president, he's only been in a year. I know you all want to blame him for everything, but you can't blame him for quite everything yet. And I don't want to blame President Bush, but we got to put it in context. Two, I love it when Republicans talk about the desire to come around the table and work together. It was a Republican-Democrat thing that happened in the Senate. It was Grassley and Baucus, and it was Hatch and Schumer. That was the centerpiece of the stimulus bill. The jobs bill was working its way through the Senate. But it was McConnell who told Reid the other day, I will not work to collect any votes for this bill if you bring it to the floor. There has to be a genuineness and a sincerity here. Republicans say they want deficit reduction and deficit control. They vote against a deficit commission. I do hope President Obama will use an executive order to create a deficit commission, in spite of what Republicans may say. You can't have it one day, Monday in the morning, and have a different message in the afternoon on Tuesday. I think it just has to be fair. Now, Democrats deserve some blame here, but Republicans have to be honest too.
This conversation exemplifies what's wrong with Washington. It's like two guys fighting in the ocean to see who drowns first. I mean, both parties are responsible for the deficits, and both parties are responsible for the fiscal suicide. And if you look at the polls that came out, a whole bunch of polls came out this week, and they show both parties very negative. Unprecedented levels of distrust in Washington. Unprecedented, historically high levels of people who want to get rid of their member of Congress from both parties. A level of distrust of Washington that is absolutely unprecedented in American history. And it's because the two sides are trying to fight each other than actually do something bipartisan or actually do anything. And so bipartisanship has become a wedge issue, a way to make the other party look bad. So bipartisanship has been twisted into just another partisan reign.
But the issue is not bipartisanship qua bipartisanship. It's hypocrisy. I mean, if you are for PAYGO, if you're for a deficit commission, until the president of the other party comes around for it and then you're against it, we're not talking policy anymore. We're not talking about bipartisanship. You shouldn't be blamed for not getting Republican votes on that. That's hypocrisy. If you vote against the omnibus bill, if you complain about the omnibus bill, if you tout your vote against the omnibus bill, it is hypocrisy to then go to your district and go to a ribbon-cutting ceremony for something that's funded by the omnibus bill that you voted against. It's not just bipartisanship as a sort of platonic virtue.
I can pick up the Democratic points if Obama wants to say, I'm going to balance the budget, and then say, but I won't cut taxes on the bottom 98%. Well, that's also somewhat hypocritical or inconsistent. If he says, I want bipartisan health care, but then invites the cameras into a bipartisan discussion and already has the plan he's going to come out with after the health care summit, that's also slightly political.
David's right about one thing, and it's the bigger point from my party. I was astonished by what happened with the jobs bill also. We are in the majority. We have an obligation to govern. And the American people react and revolt when politicians feel like they know what voters want. Health care is important, but if we don't focus on jobs and jobs and jobs again, I think Vice President Biden was right. Democrats will suffer in the fall. The reality is families are having problems at home. Businesses are having problems running themselves, or should say people running them are having problems. And the reality is people are worried about their future. And ultimately, your point is the right one. I only make the point about the back and forth of it. There has to be some honesty about bipartisanship. You can't in the morning say you want it, in the afternoon
well, let's talk about the prospect of bipartisanship when it comes to health care. The president will have a summit on February 25th. The cameras will be on. There'll be Republicans and Democrats there to talk about the issues. The truth is, Congressman, that health care reform is in trouble. But are the Republicans on health care prepared to say yes to anything?
Absolutely. From day one, back in April, I joined with over 100 Republican colleagues of mine on a letter with John Boehner and Eric Cantor to the president, who said, Mr. President, we want to work with you on health care reform. We have ideas. We want to meet with you. And for the good part of that year, the president spent his time only working with Democratic members. And it wasn't until the losses in New Jersey and Virginia and subsequently the Scott Brown election in Massachusetts that it forced them to the table to talk about truly wanting to work with us. Unfortunately, yesterday we learned that Speaker Pelosi and Harry Reid are now trying to develop a bill before the February 25th summit. If that's the case, I think it's unfortunate. We need to start from scratch, which is where the American people are on this issue. They have overwhelmingly rejected both the House and the Senate versions. And if the president was willing to start from scratch, is truly willing to be a negotiator and meet us halfway where the American people are, we will support it.
Rachel, how difficult is it that the White House clings to the belief that the best way to win the argument on health care is to pass it first? It's a very difficult way to apply leverage on Republicans to cooperate.
Well, I mean, the last time that we had Republicans in to do a bipartisan summit, or the first time we had Republicans in for a bipartisan summit at the White House, right, was March of last year. We spent the entire summer while the Senate Finance Committee didn't meet. Senate Finance Committee with 3 more Democrats on it than Republicans. So instead, this bipartisan group of 6 could meet to try to work it out. The Republicans in the House proposed 4 planks that they wanted in health reform. They wanted buying insurance across state lines, allowing individuals to pool together, state innovation, and tort reform. Versions of all of those things are in the bill. Famously in April, President Obama said, if I'm willing to go a lot further than I have on tort reform, what are you willing to give? Republicans said nothing. We're literally not willing to give anything in exchange for that. So the idea that it's just now that Democrats want to sit down with Republicans is, again, it's factually wrong, even though it's Beltway common wisdom.
David Brooks, will there be reform this year?
I would say the chances are 70% no. I mean, I don't think there's going to be much of a deal. I think the big picture is if you average like the last 10, 15 polls on the Democratic health care reforms, it's against probably 55 no, 38% yes, something like that. It's just hard to do a big national transformation when the public.
Well, that's something you wrote this week, that voters are in no mood for a wave of domestic transformation.
Right.
Were they initially?
I don't think so. I think, we had a period between 1932 and 64 where people basically trusted their government. And that ended because of Vietnam and Watergate and a lot of other reasons. When the president came in, it was not like 32 and 64. People had this incredibly high level of distrust. And if they had this economic security and you come at them with an institution they distrust with a whole bunch of change, they're going to have even more insecurity. They're going to recoil. I think that's what's happened. I think the president would have been wiser to go step by step to rebuild that trust in government. I still think that's what he should do today.